For as long as the human race can remember, people have presumed violence, and it happens to be mostly against each other. These actions caused wars, which consequently could spark up a revolution or end some humanity. But what happens when a building full of criminals are brought to war within the walls? Gruesome deaths, hundreds of fights, burning people, extreme violence, and pure fragmentation amongst each other. The 1980 Santa Fe prison riot had it all. Conditions at the Santa Fe prison were deplorable, although the prison was not always so cruel and disorderly. The prisoners received cold and raw food to eat, were beaten for no reason, overcrowded, and were denied rights that even prisoners should be able to have. The officers performing during the decade at the time were not receiving nearly the same amount of training that modern-day guards acquire. Often, there were fights due to the lack of guards, and in depth, inmates attacked encountering different ordeals and hardships. Eventually, the prisoners erupted in one of the largest prison riots in United States history on February 2nd, 1980, lasting for 36 hours. 5 prisoners attacked 3 intoxicated security guards during a small routine security inspection and took both their keys and their weapons. The prisoners now had keys and gunpowder, and they began to let other inmates out. They were divided into small groups, committing crimes, contending for control, and fighting to departure all of the commotion. They started from the southwest wing, leading to the grill gate, then eventually ending up in the main control center. If there wasn't a way inside, they used blowtorches left behind by renovation crew to cut through the walls. As the inmates gained control of the prison, they held guards hostage. These guards received numerous amounts of injuries and were abused by most of the inmates. Some of the guards eventually died from their injuries. Surprisingly, there are many prisoners who secretly took care of the guards and tried to help them. Without this help, most, if not all, would have been dead. The hostages described the ordeal as simply beyond devastating. The overall result of the riot was an exchange of ideas to improve the United States prison system. During the event, there were 33 deaths and more than 100 injured inmates. As the riot continued, the National Guard was called in. The prisoners demanded things, such as money, concluding to surrender if they were given it. National Guard was far too wise and didn't give in to the orders. They didn't go inside of the prison as well. Inside was already hundreds of men at civil war with one another. Soon, negotiations began for the release of the hostages. Eventually, after numerous conversations via radio, the inmates let hostages go one by one. Shortly after, inmates began to surrender. Wounded were immediately taken care of. Injuries were horrific. There were beheadings, amputations, even burnt bodies. One witness described his experience: the fire, the screams, the torturing of people. It's something not even a horror movie can prepare you for. The devil was let loose. It was beyond this world. There was a crash with news reporters and the people. There were even books written immediately after. Most people over-exaggerated on the topic, concluding there was thousands of dead people and such. Later, some prisoners were prosecuted for being accused of starting the riot, but most went unpunished. This upset most of the people who had lost their friends and family, because they would never have the justice of knowing their killer. It is still unknown who started the riot, but it is positive it wasn't done alone. After the deadly riot, there were many changes that were made in prison systems. Inmate to officer ratios were improved greatly. Food quality was also improved. Another thing is tougher inmates were taken out of penitentiaries and spread around other prisons. If there was a place full of tough inmates, there would be a greater chance of another riot. During the riot, prisoners were able to get out of their cells, so they had to make very big improvements on how prisons are built. Before the riot, only $2 million were spent on prisons. They now spend at least $127.5 million on the making of prisons. Now, there is a training academy system sent to be handling situations so no other riots will begin. Former guards, inmates, and most of all, the hostages deal with the ill of post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. The state also tries to cover most of those finances. Recently, there was a memorial recognizing the tragedy and declaring a pledge to the criminal justice reform. The state also spent $100,000 giving to the officers who served at the riot as a favor of gratitude and remembrance. But one of the most important changes was the inmates' behavior examination. Not only them, but guards. There was no one to apparently blame on what caused the riot. Yes, the prisoners were treated horribly, but guards were also threatened and ganged up on as well. So nowadays, there are full inspections on prisons, even on guards and inmates, to make sure the relationship is not unsatisfying, and the prison stays steady because of this. The prison was closed down officially in the early 1990s, after every issue was discussed thoroughly. The idea of the prison to reopen for tours happened in the early 2000s. There was many mixed emotions on the topic. Survivors of the riot took it as a disgrace and sentimental heartache, also as a joke. They thought of it as our state putting them through everything they went through once again.
The place should be knocked down and actually buried along with the spirits that were there.
We saw things that I don't even want to remember, you know. And to make a museum out of it, I don't think it's respecting the people that died in there, the people that suffered in there.
Through continual sequences, the state allowed the prison to be open to the public, but there are still many restrictions to try and make the matter more respectful. There has never been a riot with such toxic confrontation or so many blood-soaked outbreaks. This riot was a wake-up call as to the horrid conditions of the prison systems of the 1980s. It expanded the new exploration. The riot is obviously a study made that will never be forgotten. We are now aware of how to be safer because of this horrendous event. Through all, it has taught us all very much. What happened there was a tragedy. We do not want to be doomed to repeat the same mistakes of the past.